And I would like now to introduce the President of the Academic Senate, Pete Haro.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, and esteemed guests, on behalf of the students, faculty, and staff, I would like to welcome all of you to the beginning of Constitution Week 2012 at San Diego City College. One question I am often asked is, what is Constitution Week? Why are we doing this? For those of you that may not be aware, today, September 17th, 2012, marks the 225th anniversary of the signing of the U.S. Constitution in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So in part, we're paying homage to a document that has truly changed our nation and the world. However, the origins of Constitution Week date back to August 2nd, 1956, when President Dwight D. Eisenhower enacted a congressional resolution that had been petitioned by the Daughters of the American Revolution. President George W. Bush officially declared the inception of Constitution Week in September of 2002. Therefore, the purpose of this Observance Week is to promote the study of and education about the Constitution. In addition to today's opening address, as Professor Haro was saying, I would like to make everyone aware that my colleague, Professor Larissa Dorman, will be presenting Voices of a People's History, America Uncensored, Minority and Women Voices in American History of Political Art and Music on Wednesday, September 19th at 9:45 a.m. in the Seville Theater, where you're sitting right now. And I can speak from personal experience, ladies and gentlemen, this is an event not to be missed. Today's speaker is no stranger to the meaning and importance of the Constitution, because not only has he taken an oath to support it, he has literally spent the last 50 years of his life fighting to ensure that the fundamental rights enshrined in it apply to all Americans and every person throughout the world. As a young student in 1961, Congressman Filner joined the first freedom rides to desegregate transportation facilities in our southern states, and was arrested and imprisoned for several months in Mississippi. As a member of Congress, Congressman Filner was one of the few who voted against the USA Patriot Act when it was first introduced, and he voted against its reauthorization in 2011, and has stated that the USA Patriot Act should be repealed because it was an overly hasty response to the events of September 11, 2001, and dangerously infringes on the civil liberties guaranteed by our Constitution, and it does not make us safer. Congressman Filner was also instrumental in getting Congress to reauthorize in July 2006 the 1965 Voting Rights Act, one of the most effective and crucial civil rights laws ever enacted. In February 2011, along with several of his colleagues, Congressman Filner called on the Secretary of Defense Robert Gates and Secretary of Veterans Affairs Eric Shinseki to revisit discharge classifications of service members dismissed under the recently repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy. Congressman Filner stated, quote, "These brave men and women put their life on the line for this country, and they deserve the benefits they earn, just like any other veteran." A graduate of Cornell University, Congressman Filner received his Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry in 1963 and a PhD in the history of science from the same school in 1969. Congressman Filner has been an active member of our community for more than 4 decades. He's taught history at San Diego State University for more than 20 years. He was president of the San Diego Board of Education and served on the San Diego City Council for 5 years. In 1991, he served as deputy mayor for the city of San Diego. He was first elected to Congress in 1992, but will be retiring this year to run for the office of mayor of San Diego. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to introduce Congressman BobFilner.
Good morning. Pete, thank you for that nice introduction. I forgot I did all that, actually. But wouldn't it be great for a city to go from a mayor who is the police chief now to a guy who started his career in jail? So we're going to have a big change in who's the mayor. Thank you. The title of the talk today is The Constitution and the Civil Rights Movement. And at first glance, I mean, if you're young in City College, you might ask, why do we need a civil rights movement if we have a Constitution that guarantees everybody's civil rights? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Of course, the Constitution was never a document that was enshrined in marble, and all the words are there forever, and nobody looks at them, differently at any time. as some people sometimes argue. Constitution, in fact, enshrined slavery. And yet we would never say that equal rights, you can have equal rights in a slave society. The Constitution did not provide for women to have the right to vote. And in both those cases, we had to amend the Constitution to enshrine the right of women to vote and to really end slavery in this nation. And of course, the Constitution has been interpreted differently. The laws of segregation, which grew up in the South after slavery and into the 20th century, were laws that separated the races from one another. You couldn't participate in the same facilities, whether it was schools, restaurants, motels, drinking fountains. There'd be 2 drinking fountains in southern states, one that said white and one that said colored. And the Supreme Court in 1898 said that was okay. You can have separation of the races as long as they were equal. They enshrined the principle of separate but equal. It was constitutional. And it was not until the mid-50s that the Supreme Court changed that interpretation and said a separate is inherently unequal. And so said, segregation of those facilities was not constitutional. Yet the Supreme Court at one time said it was, and another time said it wasn't. Abortion was not seen as a constitutional right until 1972. And the Supreme Court said, no, abortion can be interpreted under the Supreme Court, the Constitution's protection of privacy. And I'm a little worried that if the issue of abortion got to the Supreme Court today, with today's Supreme Court, and it might, they will find it unconstitutional for a women's right to reproductive choice. So the Constitution is a changing document, and one that is amended, has changed interpretation, and the word seems to change some meanings given the new situation. When I had the honor, actually, of meeting Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when I was 13 years old, and I committed myself at the time to nonviolent direct action. And I read everything he wrote. He told me to read Gandhi, which I did, and followed that kind of way of looking at the world. By age 15, I was already organizing demonstrations with Dr. King for marches, and by 18, I ended up in jail. And the particular set of events I was involved in was called the Freedom Rides. And what they were designed to do explicitly was to test the laws of segregation, which were found to be constitutional in the southern states. That is, by the state constitutions, you could separate by people by race. And the tactic that Dr. King and others came up with for the civil rights movement, which started with sit-ins in 1960, and people were talking about other things almost immediately. The idea of the Freedom Rides, which were a series of bus rides that would start more in the north and cross interstate lines into the south. And people on those buses would get off and walk into what were segregated bus stations or segregated waiting rooms, segregated restrooms, segregated restaurants, coffee places in the bus terminals, and test those laws. That is, the idea would be to get arrested, which we were, because we violated the law of, in my case, Mississippi. But because we were involved in interstate commerce, that is across state lines, we would, the strategy was to then appeal those cases and get them into the federal courts, eventually the Supreme Court, which would test those laws against the federal Constitution and not just the state Constitution. That was the theory of the Freedom Rides. You break the laws that were in the states, you take the consequences, as Dr. King always says. The difference between breaking a law in the civil rights movement is that Dr. King saw law as with a capital L. If you broke a law with a small l and took the consequences of breaking that law, that is, go to prison, you were upholding the whole notion of law with a capital L. Yeah, I mean, is that clear? That is, we believe, the civil rights movement always believed in a government by laws, so why are you breaking the laws? We were breaking immoral laws, as we thought. You take the consequence, you go to prison. And then you test those laws by, the various constitutions, first of the state and then of the nation, to see whether that law was applied correctly. And so when I happened to be at Cornell University as a sophomore when the first Freedom Ride took place. It's a sort of an iconic date, so everybody remembers it. Was Mother's Day of 1961. And whenever I studied for exams and finals, I would always have a television on. I had to have the noise there. And all of a sudden I looked up and I saw this incredible picture of a Greyhound bus that had been forced off the road, firebombed, and all the people inside pulled out and almost beaten to death. This is how people responded to the Freedom Ride and the test of segregated laws, or laws of segregation, where they met it with violence. They wanted to preserve the way of life, and anybody who interfered with it would be treated as an enemy, a traitor, or, someone to be physically eliminated. So the first Freedom Ride ended up with people beaten again, as I said, almost to death. And the picture of the burning bus, the burning Greyhound bus, is an iconic picture in the civil rights movement. If you've studied civil rights or if you look at a textbook, they usually have that picture. And that just, it was incredibly moving to me as someone who had worked with Dr. King a few years earlier, and then seeing this thing, I said, I gotta join this this movement, and which I did, and I took my finals, and then organized some people at Cornell University, and we went first to Nashville, Tennessee, where we got training in nonviolence, and then took a bus, where when we got on, we only knew a couple of things. Number one, we signed our last wills and testament, because they didn't know if we were coming back. And two, we didn't know what would happen. It was very early in this thing called the Freedom Rides. The state of Alabama had gotten a lot of bad publicity from the violence a few weeks earlier, so they decided not to let any bus stop in Alabama again, even for restrooms. And then the bus I was on went to Mississippi, and what they decided in the capital, in Jackson, Mississippi, was not to allow mobs to get near us. So when he got off the bus in Jackson, there were hundreds of people with axes and sticks and bricks and stuff that we thought we were going to be dead. But the cops quickly arrested us for violating the state law of segregation, and we were eventually sentenced 6 months in jail. And most of us served about 2 months because under state law, you had to appeal your case within 2 months or you couldn't appeal it. So there I was as a student. If you have the flyer, you see my mugshot there at the time. And we weren't really prepared in terms of what we had to face or how long we would have to face it. Nobody knew where we would be arrested, how that would happen, what our sentences were. So here we are, a bunch of 18-year-olds trying to figure out how to survive at what was eventually the state penitentiary. In fact, when we entered the penitentiary, they took all our clothes and everything and gave us like a gym outfit, which said MSU across the front. And I said, wow, Mississippi State, I'm back in class. It said meant maximum security unit, which was death row. And that's the only place they could figure out, since we were an integrated group, how to keep us together. They didn't want us to infect the other prisoners. So they put us all in death row, which was a very electronically controlled kind of environment for maximum security. We were in individual cells that were electronically controlled, and we were like cells next to each other, so you couldn't see anybody else. We could talk, but we couldn't see anybody. They didn't give us anything to read, write, or we never got out for exercise. I think that's classified as torture under the UN agreements, but there we were for a couple months. Again, never ever read, nothing to write. You can talk to people. You were subject always to, I say, arbitrary violence. That is, the guards could hit you at any time, whatever they felt like it, and you were completely under their control. We were not prepared for that. And how do you, as a college student, used to, you know, having complete freedom, all of a sudden have everything just restricted and the possibility of violence? It was not an easy thing for a lot of students. I had a cellmate at first. He literally went stir crazy. I mean, he could not take the confinement, and he was ready to crack up, and they got him out for medical reasons. So some people did not survive mentally in that situation. I figured out somehow that if you try to keep your mind active, which is not easy with nothing to read or write, but you could talk and sing, and your body active, you might be able to survive. We were in a 6x9 cell. There was a bunk bed and a toilet and a sink, and that was it. Just enough room beside the cell. It was 6 feet by 9 feet. I was able to do like sit-ups and push-ups and jumping jacks. So I did that all day. Came out in the best shape of my life. And so you try to keep busy physically. You try to have conversations with people. It's very difficult, by the way, if you're in like a cell block of 18 cells and there was a mirror image behind you. How do you even have a meeting? Because you got somebody at that cell says something, I got to pass it on to somebody here, pass it on, then he passes it on to the guy behind and it goes up. So it takes a long time, although we had all day, so it didn't matter, to have a meeting. And people would be arrested every 3 or 4 days, and you'd have to debrief them to see what was going on, because we had no newspapers or anything, so people would have a chance, we would find out what was going on. I remember somebody told us that Ernest Hemingway had died. Now, I was an engineer and a math and physics major. I was a geek who didn't know anything about anything. I said, who is Ernest Hemingway? And the guy I was with was a real beatnik. I mean, the guy who went stir crazy was a real beatnik. He understood literature and philosophy and stuff. And he said, I'm going to write a poem about Ernest Hemingway, because he had just died. I said, I don't know who Ernest Hemingway is, but how are you going to write a poem? We have nothing to write on, nothing. So he spent some time in his head writing a poem, and here's what he wrote a poem, which I still remember 50 years later. He wrote, Hemingway is dead. How many ways is dead? I said, that's a poem? How's that a poem? And he looks at me, you know, if he wasn't confined with me, he would just walk, you know, we were in jail, so he couldn't walk away. He said, let me explain to you what I did here. First of all, Hemingway is dead, how many ways? That's a pun. I said, what's a pun? Then he had explained to me what the thing was, so you were playing on the words Hemingway and how many ways. Then he gave me about a 2-hour lecture of every one of Hemingway's novels. And the theme of Hemingway's novels was how human beings confront death. So how many ways is dead? It summarized everything that he ever wrote. And I said, what a genius. I still remember it, you know, 50 years later. This is what this guy taught me, by the way. You know, I didn't know anything about anything. I knew math, chem, and physics. So when I got back to college later, I transferred into liberal arts and had a different kind of, ended up with a different kind of training. But that's how we had to survive. You play games with your mind, you play games with your body, and you try to figure out how to deal with this. But you're also in a context of almost constant violence or threat of violence. There was some problem with something. We went on a hunger strike, all of us. And they responded by saying, okay, we'll show you how you have to survive. It gets pretty hot in Mississippi during the day and pretty cold at night. So what they did was they turned off the air conditioning during the day and turned it on at night. And they took away the 3 things we had. We had a pillowcase, a sheet, and a towel. They took all that away. Oh, and our t-shirt and our shorts. So you're naked and you're on a steel bunk. Try sleeping on that when it's very, very cold. That's how they left us for a week. I mean, it was really a tortured situation. But we managed to survive. And when we got out of jail, but basically, by the way, all the leaders of the civil rights movement for the next, 2 decades were on that cell block. If you know the name John Lewis, who was a fellow congressman with me, but was one of the icons of the civil rights movement, led the Selma to Montgomery March. He was in jail. Stokely Carmichael became the head of Students for Nonviolent, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. James Farmer was the head of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. Many others who, if you study civil rights movements, became leaders. We were all in there together, and it sort of molded everybody into an incredible team because we had to face this very difficult situation without a lot of background, a lot of preparation. We tried to figure out how to exist. And when we got out, of course, we appealed our cases through the legal system. My case eventually went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, of course, overturned our convictions. But in overturning the convictions, because we had violated local law, which was seen as constitutional, we had it applied according to the federal Constitution. The federal Constitution was interpreted as saying you could not segregate public facilities involved in interstate commerce. That was the ruling of the Supreme Court. You could not segregate facilities that were open to the public that were involved in interstate commerce, like buses. That basically brought down the whole legal structure of segregation, because if you couldn't segregate the bus station, it was hard to segregate the Woolworth counter, 2 doors down or a block away. That is, it was kind of stupid to try to segregate part of your facilities. So basically, the whole legal structure of segregation was overturned because of the freedom rights. Now, I'm 18 years old, and I'm thinking, wow, you get together, I mean, you put your life on the line, it turned out. I mean, I had friends killed. But we changed American history. We changed American history. We didn't make America perfect. I mean, people in this room know there's racism and discrimination and special interests and all kinds of injustices that have to be corrected. But we made America different. And I thought, wow, if you could do that in America at age 18, imagine what you can do, if you continue to work in this way. So I ended up out of that experience with a tremendous optimism about change in America. That the Constitution, interpreted in this way, changed America. But you had to challenge it. You had to make sure that the cases got into the federal courts, that got to the Supreme Court. And that took citizen action. Civil rights didn't come just by saying, oh, the Constitution says we have civil rights. People had to put their bodies on the line, literally. They had to have legal representation. They had to make the case. They had to get the public involved. It became a moral issue, and the Supreme Court eventually found in our favor. And I came out of that experience convinced that I don't care what the problem was, we could change it in America. America has probably the most open society in the world if you take advantage of it. That is, you have to take advantage of it. People say, oh, I'm not going to get involved, I don't have any power, it's special interests. But if people do get involved, the civil rights movement taught us, you can change what history is all about. And when I came out to San Diego to teach history at San Diego State, that poem, by the way, led me from engineering school into eventually a PhD in history. So I'm teaching history. And while I'm at San Diego State, my children were in elementary school, and I was the president of the PTA. And the school board announced, I didn't even know there was a school board at the time, that they were going to close my kid's school and some other schools around the city. And I talked to the principal, I said, well, why are they closing our school? They said, she didn't know they were closing a dozen schools. So I said, well, what's the school board and where do they meet? And I went down to a school board meeting. They met Tuesdays at 1 o'clock. That's to make sure maximum citizen participation. They didn't count on a professor who only taught Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So I can go on Tuesday. So I showed up at a school board meeting, and they gave me 3 minutes to talk about the issue. And I said, I asked, by the way, why are you closing the school? And they said, why are you here asking? We made this decision several years ago. And I said, but I just found out about it. Well, you should have known. And I said, well, tell me why you're going to do it. No, and I said, it's not really good for my kids. And they said, they knew better for my kids than I did. And I said, no, you don't. And they treated me so rudely, I couldn't believe this was a public body. So I went back the next week. And it turned out they were treating everybody like that. So I just started watching them. I went back every week. And I had a better attendance record than they do. And then I ended up knowing the issues better, and the press started quoting me on things I started talking about. And eventually, out of that, I ran for the school board in San Diego. I had no intention ever of entering public office. But I ran for the school board and won with 50.0001% of the vote, which to me was a mandate. And completely, I fired everybody who had been mean to me before. No, I fired all the administrators who had really, I thought, done a terrible job. And we brought in a really good superintendent, changed the whole nature of how education was seen here in San Diego. And I had so much fun doing that. I ran for the city council and then for Congress. But always with the same basic sense that I am there to represent people who have been basically left out of the political and economic system, to make sure that the Constitution and its promise of equal rights for all was actually implemented. And I learned from my personal experience that you just can't rely on the Constitution. You have to take active steps to make sure it is interpreted the way you think it ought to be, and that the actions that they take are always come out of a challenge of laws, and you have to figure out how to do that in the most innovative way possible. I learned from Dr. King the concept he called creative tension. That is, the status quo, that is, things as they are, will not change unless people feel uncomfortable, unless there's tension. You have to create some tension. That's what the sit-ins were all about. That's what the freedom rides were all about. That's what most of the demonstrations were all about. To get people to get outside their zone of comfort, that everything was fine the way it is, and get them to think about things in a different way. But if you didn't do it creatively, that was the second word, creative tension, people would respond in a very violent or non-productive, non-rational way. That is, you got to get them to think, but creatively. I remember when we went through nonviolent training, there was always this story of how do you respond to someone who spits on you? Well, if you spit back, that's just, you just get into a contest of and violence. But if you ask for the guy's handkerchief, he may just respond out of normal. Just it's plugged into you. Someone asks for you, you help him out. He gives you a handkerchief. Then he said, "What did I just do? I just gave someone a handkerchief I spit on," and it gets them to think about things. That's the whole point of curling up and not responding with violence, so people start thinking about what they're doing rather than just having not to think and respond with the violence. So I have, depending on your point of view in our city, carried out elective politics in the same way, with creative tension. That is, I try to get people to think about what they're doing. And in politics, it's not always, what should I say, politic to create tension. I mean, you're making people uncomfortable. You're saying things that maybe shouldn't be, or have not been said, or you're doing actions that not have been done in that sense. And my whole point is to get them to think about what they're doing. I do it, I think, in a fairly rational and controlled way, but people think I'm crazy sometimes. What is he doing that for? Why is he saying that? Why is he, I have been arrested many times since I've been arrested in Mississippi, including as a congressman. There's one, if you go to my office, there's a picture of me being arrested in front of the White House. There was a protest of Filipino veterans of World War II who had been denied their benefits, and I was working to try to get them back. And there was a demonstration, I got arrested. And I got another picture on the other side of the wall. 5 years later, I'm in the Oval Office with President Bush, of all people, signing my legislation. That is, we went from nobody cared about who the Filipinos were, but we had demonstrations. We got people, the TV stations ran stories about the Filipino contribution in World War II. I got, out of that arrest, 200 congressmen decided to support my legislation. And we ended up with a majority in the Congress to pass the bill. So that was not seen as being, congressional. Why are you, you're getting arrested here. But we got people to think about the situation, and we got the bill passed. So we did what we had to do, and it worked. It doesn't always work, but at this time it did. one of the big issues in our city today is foreclosures. You know, it's gone down, but it's, we were probably the center of foreclosures in America 5 or 6 years ago. And I decided this was like a civil rights issue of our time, because the banks were foreclosing, I found, in an illegal way, and it was mainly poor people, ethnic minorities that were getting foreclosed on. That is, for example, black and Latino house owners in our country make up about, I don't know, say 20% of homeowners, but they accounted for 50 over 60% of the losses of wealth in foreclosures. Try to, you know, the math doesn't make up. It makes sense. That is, they were either targeted or a part of a population that was easiest to foreclose on. So I saw it as a very much of a civil rights issue. So I try to figure out bills. We sponsored bills and other things. And I decided we'd have a sit-in at a house that was going to be foreclosed on. That is, we surrounded a house with about 200 people. The sheriff was supposed to show up at a certain time, and we were going to say, no, you cannot foreclose. Show us the evidence that you have. Turns out, by the way, if they try to foreclose in your house, they do not have, the bank doesn't have any deed, because they sold it and resold it, and it's in Dubai somewhere. They can never prove that they own the house. So, and we were going to make it, you know, like a sit-in and or civil freedom rights and challenge this all over the nation. Well, it turned out the bank, which was the 8th biggest bank in the world, did not want the publicity of arresting a congressman and having all that. And the sheriff said, I'm not going to get caught in that controversy. He didn't show up. So we saved the house of that lady, and in fact, the bank negotiated and gave her a much better deal later. And I was sort of sad that we didn't get arrested, because I thought it would spark something over the whole nation. But I use that example to show that the philosophy of Dr. King and others, and Gandhi, and the sense of how you deal with a constitution which in many ways is incredible in its wording as a guarantor of civil and human rights in our nation. Not totally, as I pointed out, but many of the words can be applied to situations when we didn't expect it to be applied to Hispanic citizens or gay citizens, for example. We can now do that. But you have to take an active position in response to that Constitution. It's not going to do it on its own. Amendments do not occur. You know, the amendments about slavery only came after the worst war internally we've ever fought. The movement the amendment to give women the right to vote came after the suffragette movement. It didn't just occur because someone said, well, we were wrong. You have to challenge it using the principles, and then trust the system, as it were, the processes that have been set up to come to the conclusion that we are a nation of civil and human rights. Let me just stop there. I'd take any questions you might have. I don't know if that light has to stay on. I can't see anybody with that light on, but I look forward to any questions or discussions you might have. Thank you. Yes, sir. My opponent, by the way, running against me for mayor, set up this thing, so. I'm sorry?
Is it okay I call you Bob?
Yes, sir. Dr. Bob, actually. Not just Dr. Bob.
I meet with your colleague, Tony Young, every other week. We have cappuccino, Euclid, and he's also the president now at the Congress.
Of the city council.
The city council.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, my question is here. You know, I have done a lot of meetings. Matter of fact, I was at the Jacob Center when we had bumpers, and you was speaking to the community in the 4th district. I attended those meetings also. But I have a loaded question. Your opponent have gotten over 200 signatures to get the pension plan, to reform pension on the ballot, which passed. And his whole theory was to shake up the House first and find all this where the money we misspending and misfunding. And let's clean that up first, and then we can get some of the park and recreation and library hours back, which we have gotten some more city library hours. But you guys voted against that, and now you are for it. I would like if you would cast a little light on your, what you think about that right now.
You've been brainwashed. Everybody hear the question? I mean, it's referring to the Mayoral's race, and you know, before the major issue on the primary was so-called reform of our pension system. That is, we have roughly a $2 billion pension debt and no real plans to deal with it. How does a city have a debt of $2 billion and try to move forward? I mean, that's basically the issue. Now, here's the problem, the way you phrased it and the way my opponent has phrased it. Oh, and my opponent led the effort for a referendum to reform the pension system by setting up a so-called 401k plan for new employees that is a private system relying on the stock market. Okay, here's the problem, and I opposed that Proposition B, although it passed with 2/3 of the vote. Here's the problem. Number one, and first and foremost, Mr. DeMaio blamed the city employees for the problem. That is, we got to go after those city employees because they caused the problem. The city employees did not cause the problem. Wall Street greed was the first problem. That is, when we had this tremendous stock market decline 5 years ago or so, no pension system kept its value because everybody lost. Everybody lost. When the stock market collapses, everybody that's invested in the stock market loses. So every pension system in America was invested in the stock market, lost half its value. So that's number one. And second, we had a couple mayors, Republican mayors, by the way, in the past, who basically stole money from they said, I'm going to build a ballpark for the Padres, or I'm going to bring the Republican convention to San Diego as we did in 1996, I think. But I ain't going to use any public money for that. You know what they did? They stole money from the pension system, winked at the employees and said, don't worry, we're going to give you better benefits if you don't say anything that we took this money to do. So they built the Padres Stadium, they brought the convention here with no public money, except it was pension money. And the reason why they got the employees to agree to it was they raised the benefits in a way that was not really sustainable, but it was a trade-off for them shutting up. So here we have a pension system that's half its values. You had two mayors that stole the money. Yeah, you're going to have a problem. And Mr. DeMaio comes up with, oh, it's the city's employees' problems. Well, for 4 or 5 years, the city employees took no pay raise. They raised their contribution, percentage-wise for the pension. The city cut a lot of benefits, like health benefits, to try to bring it into, the employees said, okay, we're going to have to help correct this and make it sustainable because we want pensions, when we retire. And the system was on its way, it's on its way to recovery. DeMaio made a big issue in order to get elected mayor that, no, the system is a mess, the public employees are the problem. He said, I'm going to make, in fact, San Diego the Wisconsin of the West. Now, he didn't mean Bob LaFollette of progressive history, or he didn't mean Senator Russ Feingold, a recent progressive senator. He meant Scott Walker, the governor, who came to office to break the power of unions, to undercut collective bargaining, to privatize government. So that's what DeMaio wanted to do. So what did he do? He took the employees, who, by the way, and most people don't know this, who do not have Social Security benefits. The city of San Diego employees do not have Social Security benefits, and said, we're taking away your pension and putting you on the 401k. The 401k could mean zero at a given point. So you're going to take employees who work 20 or 30 years and say you have no pension? That's wrong. It was wrong. So I opposed it. And I had a better plan, in fact. I had a better plan. I won't go into it now because right now it's a little moot. Now, the voters did not agree with me, and they bought the lie that it was the employees, and they bought the thing that, and by the way, this system does not, the new system, because it applies to new employees, you cannot take away benefits from the old employees. So the debt is still there. There's nothing, it doesn't do anything. It was a political ploy to find a scapegoat at a time when people feel very, in economic uncertainty, scapegoats come out. They could be black, they could be gay, they could be immigrants. Here they were public employees this time. the public is subject to scapegoats when things are tough. So the electorate bought the situation and passed Prop B. Now, it's now being challenged in the courts, and I think the challenge may be sustained. That is, I don't think Prop B was constitutional, since we're talking about constitution. Because it did not set up if employees do not have Social Security, they have to have a reasonable alternative. The government body has to have a reasonable alternative. I don't think this is. But let's say Prop B is validated by the courts. I opposed it. I'm the mayor now. I have to implement it. I mean, the voters have said it. I didn't like it, but I believe, like Dr. King, in law with a capital L, I have to follow the law. So I have to implement it. So I'll find the best way to implement it that I can. And I think, in fact, I can implement much better than my opponent, because he declared public employees as the enemy. I say they're not the enemy, they're doing the work we have to be done. I could probably negotiate a better deal with them than he can, and a quicker deal. So, without getting more into detail, yeah, I oppose the thing. I thought it's a bad thing. I think it'll be found to be unconstitutional. But if it passes legal muster, I got to implement it. So I haven't changed my mind, but I'm changing my position. If I'm the mayor, what am I going to do? I can't say I'm just going to pick and choose which laws the ones I like, I'll implement the ones I can't. That's not the way our system works. If you believe in law, I'll try to change it in some way by legal processes, but the law is there. Does that answer? Thank you. See, you've been brainwashed, you see. I've now re-washed your brain. Okay. There's other hands in the back there, please?
Hello, my name's Eamon. I just want to thank you for performing on this platform with a bunch of us students. Well, sorry,
wrong choice of words. For?
The school, and hopefully you.
The guy next to you, I can't see.
He's also for the school.
Okay, because usually the Mayo has somebody filming.
It's stereo 3D. We're gonna do it all up. Just want to thank you for coming to talk to a bunch of students. We've been learning to be critical thinkers, and you seem like a critical thinker. So my question is more towards teaching, and you were on the school board. What do you see as far as your plans for making sure that my children in the future and any children that are in this room coming up are provided the same kind of education that we were, where we were taught to look through the lines and not take everything with a grain of salt, and what kind of security for teachers that are able to teach like that, where they have the freedom in the classroom to stack and structure and do everything like that. What can you bring to the table from your school board experience?
Great question, thank you. You are critically thinking here. You're to be congratulated, Mr. President. The first thing, by the way, that will allow critical thinking is not to have a whole system being evaluated, judged by one test. I mean, that is and only about 10 or 12 congressmen, by the way, voted against the so-called No Child Left Behind. I was one of those, because what it says is we're going to evaluate teachers, we're going to evaluate educational achievement, we're going to evaluate students by a test. Now, some people are good at taking tests. I haven't been one of them. So I always seem to be bright because I know how to pass tests. But that's not a test is not any, well, it could be a measure of intelligence, but it's a pretty bad measure. What do people learn in different ways? Or they can show themselves in different subjects. They show their intelligence in different ways. They're more right brain and left brain, or however we now phrase it. There are lots of ways both to measure students' achievement, teachers' effectiveness, and achievement in ways other than a test. And what the test does is force you, one, to teach certain subjects to the denial of others. For example, we've taken a lot of the music and art and drama out of the school system. Yet some kids need that a way to stimulate their own sense of learning and achievement. Besides, as human beings, we need it. So, one, you're eliminating a good part of what people need for their own education, their own sense of learning, and how they may, the trick of education, you guys tell me, who are teachers, once you decide that you can learn and that you are good at learning, there's no stopping you. The trick is to find ways to give you that sense that you know how to learn. And some people do it in a whole variety of ways. Some people do it through the creative arts. Some people do it through computers. Some people do it through sports. But once you learn that you have that self-esteem and know that you can learn, you can learn anything. But you got to give people the opportunity. If you're just saying you got this test is everything you're going to learn, you're eliminating a good part of the students in terms of saying that they have any achievement. And you force teachers to teach to the test. And they not only teach the subject matter. We had a scandal in Seneca Unified when I was on the school board. They actually gave some people, the teachers got the answers to the questions and gave them to the students. I mean, you're not learning anything, right? You're learning to memorize an answer to a question, and because that's how the teachers are judged, that's how the students are judged, that's how the school is judged, and on and on. It's ridiculous. I mean, it's the complete opposite of what education, as you define it, critical thinking is all about. So that's the first thing I do, get rid of that measure. And yet that's we seem to be moving more and more to that. As mayor, by the way, I'm going to speak up for the arts. You know, I'm going to speak up for a variety of methods for judging both teachers and students, that you give students and teachers an opportunity to show various ways of teaching and learning, because they're all important. And we're going in the opposite direction, and it's not just a question of money, although we've got to have adequate resources. It's a question of how you're going to measure, and it's the easiest thing for political figures and for the public in some ways to take a test score, and that's how you measure. It's wrong, and I'll be, just as a quickest answer is to fight that. There's all kinds of other things. I mean, we've been involved with STEM, you know, science, technology, engineering, and math, which are very important. But I would like to put some steam into that, add A, S-T-E-A-M, which is the arts, and say, you know, our basic education has to include all of those. And it's not just teaching engineering, but in fact, some kids may come to engineering once they know how to, if they're good at visualizing things and drawing things, somehow that's brought up, then they become engineers too. I mean, there's lots of different ways of capturing children's and students' sense of learning. The real trick, tell me again, you educators, is to get people, as I said earlier, to know they can learn, and to get that. I mean, if you're going to learn at this level of, you know, there's sort of a curve of, if you can learn at this level, you're going to be far better off, right? And that's the trick of teaching, is to get people to learn at that level. And we're not doing it right. We're not doing it with enough money. And although I'm not in charge of the school board as mayor, I can talk about these issues in a more or less knowledgeable way and try to be a leader in that regard. Yes.
Yeah, I find that you know, you're talking about the civil rights movement and, you know, the rights of others. What I find kind of frightening is that I think our Constitution is under attack by individuals in this country that may oppose gay marriage or abortion or gun rights or immigration. And those who speak out, you know, are being labeled Nazis or racists or whatever. And, you know, the point I'm trying to make is that isn't that unconstitutional? I mean, to try to, what they call heckler's veto, by telling people they can't express themselves even though they don't agree with their fellow man. That, you know, these people should be quiet and take what.
But no, you shall have the freedom of speech.
That because you don't agree with something, you are become an outcast or a leper.
No, I mean, that's ridiculous for a society.
In other words, you're forcing your beliefs. It's basically all this is beliefs. Some people believe in, and you know, don't believe in gay marriage. Believe in, you know, heterosexual type unions, or some people believe that, you know, we should have gun, you know, not gun control, or some people believe that we shouldn't, the immigration issue. And then if you don't go along with this concept or thinking, then you're basically, you're un-American. You're racist. Or,
I mean, that concept, because of your beliefs that you're an American, is un-American. That is, we believe everybody, we should believe everybody has the right to their beliefs. Now, we also believe in majority rule, And there's got to be a decision made, and you know, whether it's the Supreme Court or the legislature or yourself personally. And
But I feel that's under attack too. I mean, when people say Proposition 8 with the, here in the state of California, when they opposed gay marriage. When the majority said they did not, I think it was 8.
right, Proposition 8,
You know, they said they didn't want it.
the majority of the states said they didn't want it, right?
Court overruled them. So there went majority rule.
No, wait, but majority rule, you cannot eliminate, as some polls show, the majority doesn't even believe most of the 10 amendments of the Constitution. Are we going to eliminate them by majority vote? That's why we have a court system to deal with what they call there's something of the majority. I mean, tyranny of the majority. That is, we believe majority rule, but you cannot, number one, undercut minority rights through majority rule, and you also cannot go against the Constitution by majority. And the Constitution of the state of California says Prop 8 was against the Constitution. Now, you may disagree with that. Then there's ways to change the Constitution and get what you think. I mean, everybody can call everybody else whatever they want if they don't agree with them, but you're assuming, first of all, that the majority has all knowledge and power and truth. Yeah, but you said the majority ruled, and now they're overturning it. Yeah, because we have a system which judges majority rule by the Constitution.
You don't think that inflames the majority?
Yeah, it will. Yeah. The majority voted for slavery too, and it inflamed them. That's why we had a civil war. But
Is not marriage a belief? Is not marriage a belief
yeah.
system? Is that considered a religion? And religion being belief, and it should not be infringed on by the Constitution?
Yeah, you want to have a constitutional debate on whether there should be marriage equality or not? I mean, if you want to have a debate, I'm happy to, but we're debating a process. That is, if you believed in Proposition 8, you put it on the ballot, and it passed. But we have another step in that system. It has to be, I'd still be in jail if we didn't have that appeal, to the court system. Now, we don't know how the Supreme Court is going to rule on that yet, by the way. It could find Proposition 8 constitutional. Then those who disagree with it have to go back and figure out a way. But no one is right or wrong about their belief on that. It's a question of it being in accord with our Constitution. That's the issue.
Well, you guys in Congress passed the Patriot Act, and don't you think that's strict because our...
Yeah, that's why I voted no.
Freedom of speech or freedom of privacy?
Yeah, that's why I voted no. But and if it's challenged in the courts may find that either constitutional or unconstitutional. We have a process. I can't say because the majority passed the Patriot Act, they're a bunch of jerks, and I'm not going to ever listen to them again. I voted no. I did my constitutional authority, voted no. Then the people have a right to decide whether I should be in office because I had that vote or not. We have a whole system of checks and balances. So I'm not sure what you're arguing that...
Well, I think we're picking apart other people's personal beliefs through the, you know...
Yeah, but that's what society means. Look, I could be against a war. And I've been against virtually every war that we have fought since World War II. Does that mean? But I belong to a society which voted to those. That means I pay my taxes, and it goes to war. I can't have my beliefs as the sole. Otherwise, I'm the dictator. If the majority has voted different, I have to go along with it. I don't have to agree with it, but I can't withdraw from this. I could say I'm not paying my taxes. You can put me in jail and all that.
They don't agree with gay marriage. People are being terrorized and dictated.
No. Tell me how somebody's marriage, let's say a heterosexual marriage, is threatened by homosexual marriage. I don't see it. I don't see it. How are you what? No, nobody's threatening anybody here.
Well, no, but you know, the minority is enforcing other people's beliefs on...
No, we're not. I'm not forcing you to marry a gay guy. No, I'm not.
You want someone
You
else?
can marry whoever you want.
Next question.
Go ahead.
You mentioned the fact a little while ago that there's a debt that still needs to be paid after your incumbent was blaming the city workers for the debt. Well, the president, the governor, even the mayor House says we're broke. where's all the money gonna come to still pay for the debt? You never alluded to how you could, if you get elected mayor, how you're gonna pay for that debt, on top of the fact that none of the teachers, because I'm part of the Spring Valley Mesa school system, where the money is to pay for the raises that these teachers need, along with taking care of unemployment in the city and all the other things. Where's all this money coming?
Well, I mean, you're asking a deeper question. Let me answer the specific question about the city's debt,
Okay.
which can be handled in a number of ways, which I have proposed. For example, if we negotiated a 5-year contract with city employees, I could save $250 or $300 million off that debt just by the 5-year contract, because the debt is a projection based on certain assumptions. A contract gives concrete things, and so the debt would be decided based on the reality, not the assumptions. I could lower the debt immeasurably. Second, it's being lowered naturally because of the way the reforms that have been done in the past have taken effect. Lastly, I would refinance that debt, by the way, at a much lower interest rate. I mean, if you have a house that you're paying, you have a mortgage on, you're paying 8%, and you know there's 3% or 4% rates available, you'd be silly not to refinance, right?
Correct.
I propose refinancing it to save $1 billion, and my opponent laughed at me and said, I'm just kicking the can down the road, I'm financing debt with debt. Yeah, that's what a refinance does, except you're paying less, and you lower your debt by doing that. So there are lots of ways to deal with it. In general, though, you're referring to a much bigger problem. Are we willing as a nation to fund the programs in government that we all want? And that's a much bigger question, a different question.
Well, I'm asking you though, being a congressman, because the big question is, everybody's asking is, where's the money gonna come from to begin with to do it, period?
Oh, you want my answer as a congressman?
Sure.
Okay. I haven't had to answer that one long time because I'm running for mayor. But look, we are the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. The question for us is our priorities and what we fund, not whether we have the money to fund it, in my opinion. I mean, we are funding, for example, we put ourselves $3 or $4 or $5 trillion into debt with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't know why we fought them. I voted against them. So we can bring down the cost of war, which has a direct effect on our economy. We have billions, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of subsidies for people who are not unemployed, who are not, but for oil companies that are making the biggest profits in the history of this earth. I would change that kind of priorities, is all I'm saying. I can give you 100 examples, but we have the money to do the job we have to do. It's a question of how we're going to do it. I mean, if you're a millionaire and paying a lower percentage of your taxes, as Mr. Romney does, for example, than his own secretary, there's something wrong with the tax system. And we ought to change it. So I think we can fund what we want to do with a change in priorities.
Thank you.
There's a question that's very rare.
Please, preacher.
If you don't win the election, what's your plan for you?
Going to teach at City College. I just got tenure. I'll stay involved in some way. I mean, I've been a professor for 20 years. I've been involved in government for 30 years. I mean, I have a background to, I think, continue to contribute to our city and the state and nation, so I'll find a way to do that.
I'm Christian, and in my religion, my religious beliefs are that we cannot marry the same sex, right? Putting us to the side of our religious beliefs, as a human, personally, I believe that every person has the right to marry who they want to marry, right? And now my question is, what do you think about having kids being taught about gays and lesbians? Like, what do you think about that?
I mean, why not? I mean, it's part of the reality of our society.
Right, but what do you think about...
I'm sorry?
But what do you think about having innocent children being taught that at a very early age in school?
about war, they learn about sex, they learn about all kinds of violence. Just turn on the television. I mean, why are you trying to shield them from that versus everything else? I mean, you're not going to be able to shield children from this stuff. Teach it honestly and openly. I mean, there are various things. I mean, you know, when you talk about sex education, what do they say? Only answer the question that was asked, right? I mean, don't try to give a child more than he's really asking for, right? You could do the same with you know, gay and lesbian relationships. I mean, they may not be asking the question that you want to answer. And, you know, you have to develop a reasonable curriculum based on age and stuff that kids can handle. But the same is true in sex, violence, war, you know, marriage, on and on. I mean, the same question we have to ask all the time, whether we're parents or whether we're school officials or whether we're government officials. But I think to make it off limits is not the way to go.
We've got about 8 minutes remaining, Congressman.
Okay, I'll get the sign.
Oh,
Is that, I can't see, is that Peter?
yeah, Congressman, I have a quick question. You know, having...
This guy's father taught me everything I know in politics, so I have to give him a question. Right?
I'm sure
Jess is your dad, right?
Yes, he is.
His father was a city councilman who was, I think, the first Latino elected official in San Diego, and taught us all a great deal. He taught us all a great deal, so thank you, Peter.
Thank you. You know, having mentioned that you knew Dr. King, I'm sure you were also, he made you aware of the fact that, you know, the civil rights movement was much more than just about desegregation. It was also about addressing poverty. And, you know, I think as Dr. King referred to the Vietnam War as this demonic suction tube of war that was, you know, afflicting society in the 1960s. My question is, why do you think that today Americans don't quite make that connection? I mean, they understand voting rights, they understand marching to desegregate, but they don't make the connection with, you know, fighting poverty, with ending war. That somehow just doesn't seem to register. I was wondering what you thought about that.
Well, I think you're right, but let's just get the historical perspective. Dr. King and the civil rights movement in general it was not clear that they should be anti-war or anti-poverty at first. I mean, that was a real debate within the civil rights movement because some people felt, well, if you know, we're fighting as blacks in this case, but say as Latinos or gays or whatever minority you want to talk about, we're fighting for respectability. And if we start challenging deeper issues in the society, we will not be viewed favorably. And so that interferes with our civil rights thing. Dr. King argued, I think rightly, that these other issues are so big and so important and they affect African Americans and others so disproportionately that unless we talk about them, we're never going to solve civil rights. So I agreed with, and you know, when he made his first speech against the war in Vietnam, I mean, that was major news because blacks weren't allowed to talk about foreign policy. I mean, they were kept in a box that said, you talk about civil rights and then we'll listen. But if you try to talk about other things, we ain't going to listen to you anymore. He had to break that box. And the same with poverty. When he had his, you know, march just before he was killed, because I was there, the March 68, what did they call it?
Memphis sanitation workers.
No, but in Washington there was a poverty, or maybe it was just after he was killed. He was organizing the poverty march, which raised this issue. And people said, you know, all blacks are not poor. Why are you making this a thing, an issue? So it took some great, incredible courage on his part to link all those issues. Now you see the linkage, I see the linkage, not everybody sees them. And that's an education and political process for all Americans that have to do that. People like when Bobby Kennedy first decided, I mean, to take a tour through poor America, that was a very courageous thing because, you know, white senators were not supposed to bring up this thing of poverty. It's a political process to get those issues in front of the voters and link them in a way that you see and I see, but no, most people don't see it. And the establishment and the leadership that wants some of these policies wants to keep them separate. Oh, we don't talk about foreign policy. We can't talk about that. That's politics, right? When the country goes to war, if you're not for this war, you're not patriotic. So they have propagated the view that you can't even question war because that's an unpatriotic thing to do. I remember, in the Vietnam War, not one congressman voted against it. When I had a vote on the Iraqi war, I said, I ain't going to be one of those congressmen. And we started with 5 congressmen against the war in Iraq. We ended up with 135. Now that wasn't a majority, but that showed, some deep problems with that war. But the establishment who fights those wars doesn't want us to debate them. So they're against anybody, let alone blacks, talking about it. On poverty, again, the reigning message in this country, we're a middle-class country, we don't have poverty. Everybody has access, and it's your own fault if you're poor. They don't want to see it as a systematic thing that may subject certain people, and especially certain ethnic minorities, the odds of being poor are much higher. Those are political discussions that some people don't want us to have. So it's a political decision in and of itself to make those linkages. And we gotta force it. Your dad understood it. He taught me, and we gotta keep making those arguments.
We have time for one more question.
The one by the cameras.
By the camera.
Congressman, today is the 1-year anniversary of the Occupy Wall Street movement. There's been over 8,000 arrests nationwide. I'm a veteran, I served 15.5 years, and I also documented it right here in San Diego, witnessing a bunch of things against our First Amendment rights as, of our Constitution. As a congressman, what do you think the movement has accomplished? And as a mayor, how would you handle the activists differently than the current administration, or the one that is running against you?
Great question.
Well, as someone who, was part of movement struggles my whole life, I was very encouraged by the Occupy movement when it first started. I had some arguments with them, disagreements on the way they proceeded, but I thought they provide a lot of energy to the system at first. I thought that in local situations, the cops should have been invisible. That is, in various cities, including San Diego, where I don't think they took violent action, but they were very visible. And they should not have been. People were exercising their constitutional rights. And the cops tend to aggravate that rather than calm it. So they could have been around but not visible, and that's what I would have done. And I wouldn't have moved them out of the central part of the city there. I have a disagreement with the way it proceeded and why a year later we hardly ever talk about it. It's a very, what shall I say, anti-historical movement. That is, it doesn't see other things happening beforehand, say the civil rights movement, as being at all important, illustrative, or as an example to come to grips with. And people in office, and there's a variety of us in office, from some of those who have been through all these movements to some who are against them all, we were all treated the same. 25, I'll call them liberal congressmen, met with the leadership, although they claimed there was no leadership, of the Occupy movement in Washington to say, what can we do to help? And they said, nothing. You're part of the problem. You're the corrupt people. And I looked around the room. There must have been 1,000 years of experience in protests and jail. And I said, I don't think we are the same people as the others. And they said, no, you're all the same. Well, how do you, that's wrong. There's a whole range of people in office and out of office, and there's some good and some bad, from whatever your perspective is. So you got to work with the good. When the Atlanta Occupy movement wouldn't allow John Lewis, who was one of the most incredible heroes of our society today, they wouldn't let him talk because he was just another guy. That's just wrong. That just shows you nobody's interested in learning from the past. Yeah, the past can't teach us everything. You got to do new things, but there's stuff to be learned. And there's people willing to help. After they said we don't need any help, by the way, I left the room when they passed around the can for some cash. I said, you don't want our advice, but you want our money? It's the same capitalist, corrupt stuff. Why are you wanting our money? And I walked out. So I have again, I wanted to enshrine in law some of the demands of the Occupy movement. I said, we have no demands. We don't have leaders. We don't have demands. How can you ever advance if you don't have any program? I mean, how do you measure what you're, your advance? And besides, if you want to do something like end the war, who's going to do it? It has to be the Congress. So try to influence the Congress. Or if you want universal health care, it has to, the laws have to be changed. I mean, I agree with that stuff, but they didn't want our help. What are you going to do? So they're going to die out, and I think they have. But there's no what's the program of the Occupy? There is none. How can you advance as something that's going to come without a program? You got to have a program. I don't care if it's good or bad. You got to have a program. Thank you all very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's have one more round of applause for Congressman BobFilner. Quick announcement, my students want to make sure that I know they're here. Come see me real quick, and I'll make sure I mark you down, all right? And thank you very much. Don't forget, Wednesday morning, 9:45, Voices of People's History.